Since people have been egging me on for a while now to do a piece about a top 10 or a tier list, I figure why the heck not? So, for today, we're going to start with something very small and talk about the top 10 major decisions or events that radically change what it meant to design games or work in the game industry. When trying to come up with my list here, I wanted to think of major events, not so much games, that went on to define the game industry itself. So we won't be talking about things like World of Warcraft, Call of Duty, Fortnite, but the aspects behind some of these games will be showing up. And to begin with, let's start out with number 10, and that is of course an oldie but a goodie, the arrival of Nintendo into the game industry. For those of you too young to remember, there was a time when the game industry was set to crash, and this was around 1982-1983, when the market became so saturated with low-quality games and everybody trying to make consoles that there was just no trust left in the game industry, and people moved on. And this was the first major scare of what it meant to be in the game industry, and why for the longest time a lot of people did not really think the industry was going to be viable, much less something that could become a major business. Of course, Nintendo entered and basically changed things forever. And there's a lot of history about Nintendo as a company and Nintendo's push in the 70s and 80s into the game industry. And there are people who've written books and have done far more elaborate discussions on that. But Nintendo arrived here first with Donkey Kong. That was, I think, 1981, 1982, if I remember right. But, of course, we all remember them the most for the Nintendo Entertainment System. That was 1985, if I remember right. And that basically changed everything. The quality of games, the arrival of so many names and popular franchises put Nintendo in a position of being king of the game industry. And they're going to be showing up several times in this video just because of the impact they've had. And it's very easy for younger audiences or for people just getting in the game industry now to look at Nintendo as kind of, the weird and wacky company who just puts out these games. Maybe they'll work, maybe they won't, but they're just there having fun. No. Nintendo has been one of the most business-driven companies in the game industry, and you have to understand the amount of clout and power they have from about 1985 to, we could arguably say, maybe 1995, maybe 1996, pushing it there. And it's one of the reasons why they've had such a long-lasting relationship with the game industry, because of the amount of money they've earned. And there are so many stories about, how hard it was to work with Nintendo and some of the less than the kind things that they did to keep themselves number one, and why they've earned so much money because of it. But number 10 actually leads us to number 9, and that is Sony entering the game industry. Now, the story of Sony is one of those truth is stranger than fiction moments for game development. But as the story goes, back in, I think it was 1991, 1992, Nintendo decided to partner up with then only electronics manufacturer Sony in order to produce a CD-based or CD-ROM-based attachment for the Super Nintendo, a PlayStation, a name no one here has ever heard of, I know. This was to compete with Sega, who was also in their own midst of a hardware kind of war with Nintendo with the 32X and the Sega CD. So the plan was that Sony would create this attachment, and it would work both as a standalone platform and as an attachment for the SNES. Basically be able to play SNES games and kind of SNES PlayStation combined titles. And there's rumor of there being, I think it was a 3D or 2.5D Mario game meant to be built around that system. Now, the idea was that Sony would retain control over the PlayStation side of things, so they could decide what games would be released for it, and especially for these separate or being run separately. And as we all know, Nintendo does not like it when they're not in the loop. and they did everything they could to convince Sony to let them have full control, and Sony said no. And in perhaps one of the biggest oh snap moments of the game industry, the day before Sony was going to unveil their partnership with Nintendo at the Consumer Electronics Show, I think this was 93? Again, years are not my strong suit here. Nintendo announced a partnership with Philips to make the Philips CDI, basically rendering Sony's announcement and work obsolete. And Sony was not too happy with that, and decided that, well, we have the standalone platform that can make or that can use CD-based games. Why don't we make our own console? And in 1994, such a very, very long time ago, the Sony Playstation was released. And for my money, I always find that the competitors in Nintendo were very much influential in terms of, or their impact in terms of the game industry. Because again, you have to remember just how much of a stranglehold Nintendo had on game development. And that was real. Nintendo could basically kill any company they wanted if they said they wouldn't allow their games on their platform. So everybody was basically hoping and pleading for the big competitor to Sony. Or I'm sorry, to Nintendo. And when Sony came out, that was a massive deal. Because they were the first kind of one of the major names to do a CD-based platform, despite, of course, the 3DO and the Atari Jaguar. Though I think the Atari Jaguar was a cartridge-based one as well. But Sony had the manpower, they had the money, and they had the technology to really push forward with a technologically superior console. And the adoption of CDs as the next storage medium for video games was massive. This is when we began to see that jump, not just in terms of graphical quality, but also of the game designs that could be told and explored on a CD-based platform, or wow, it's not easy to say, CD-based medium. There we go. With major names such as Final Fantasy, Metal Gear, all the crazy RPGs we saw, even the first Persona games were released over here on the PlayStation. And the PlayStation to the PlayStation 2 really brought along this kind of golden age of very amazing and very classic games. Of course, that little known game, Castlevania Symphony of the Night. But most importantly, this was the shot fired at Nintendo that stuck. And we could argue that since that time, Nintendo has really been on catch-up. And not only that, but Sony's ability to push into the game industry kind of led to the motivation for Microsoft to get in the early thousands with the Xbox. And there's so much theory crafting we could do about what happened if the original Nintendo-Sony partnership came together like that. And it'll be fascinating to explore, although we'll never really see the full answer to that. But who knows, maybe that will happen someday, hell freezing over and all that. As we move into number 8, this is another one where Nintendo had an involvement in, and for this first half of our top 10, they're going to be coming up a lot just due to the sheer amount of influence they've had. But for the longest time, people have always said about why Nintendo didn't meet the same fate as Sega did, dropping out of the console market in the early thousands. And a big reason for that is the handheld market. And Nintendo, again, you have to understand just how much money they made between being number one in the console market for a good decade and being number one in the handheld market pretty much up until the time of the mobile game industry taking over. While other developers, including Sony, tried to beat them in this space, Nintendo held on for the longest time. And handheld games, or handheld gaming, is a very big deal. When this first started, it was simply as a way of playing, the lesser games, or the console extra light version of these titles. Anyone remember the original Game Boy? But as we entered the end of the 90s and into the early thousands, handheld gaming started to get into its own. 2004 was the launch of the DS, which I still can't believe was that long ago. And Nintendo really capitalized with handheld games, thanks to a few specific philosophies that other developers began to follow. The first was making sure that the handheld was universally different compared to the console. Again, the DS was the first time we really began to see this innovation, and then that was carried over into the 3DS. But the point was, instead of just releasing, this game but smaller on a handheld, developers began to make full use of the system, allowing them to experiment in the space, such as with games like Advance Wars, Fire Emblem, or basically using classic design on a platform that they knew they didn't have to have a huge budget for, nowhere near as vast as a fully 3D console game. We saw Contra come over here, Castlevania, I think it was Golden Sun was another big one, and many, many more. Not only that, but it also helped Nintendo in terms of being more appealing to third-party developers. And it's something we'll come back to later on in this video. But the handheld line brought portability and playability, where people could literally play games wherever they wanted. And again, this was long before the rise of smartphones, the internet everywhere, Wi-Fi, and all that. And like I said, this has been a major point, and we can also tie this into everybody's favorite game, Pokemon. And between Pokemon, handheld games, and Nintendo's control over the console model for so long, it's this that has allowed them to secure themselves in the top positions no matter how good or bad of a time they had. And unless we're working directly with Nintendo, it's kind of hard to know just exactly how much money did they earn with these three moneymakers were working at full swing. But Nintendo's time in the top of the handheld market didn't last forever, and that takes me to number 7, and that is the mobile game market. For my audience, or most of you watching this right now, we all tend to scoff at mobile games. They are cheap, they're, heavily exploitable, they're, the horrible games of the industry. But the mobile side has been huge in terms of impacting almost all aspects of game development. And this really didn't start until the rise of the smartphone era. As Blizzard so lovingly pointed out last year, everyone has a phone these days. And the first mobile games, or the first games for mobile, were horrible. They were worse than the original Game Boy line. They were just not all suited for the platform. But when smartphones began to appear, and suddenly we had basically a very low power but still importantly useful PC or Mac, depending upon your preference, or Linux, in the palm of our hands, this began to change things. And much like the rise of the 3DS or DS into the 3DS, mobile games are no longer considered where you can just throw games away on. You could spend the time and the money to put something together of high value. Now, with that said, though, unfortunately, the extent of mobile games have really turned to the rise of free-to-play and monetization elements. And I know, depending upon who you talk to, you either love them as a developer or you hate them as everybody else. Monetization along these lines has radically changed game development. So much so that we are unfortunately seeing AAA developers making use of them. But the idea, of course, is a very brilliant one. It could have turned out to be a lot more ethical if we can somehow summon Ramin here for this. But the fact that you allow people to play a game with no upfront costs, and again, that was something that was completely alien to the game industry. Even the MMO games of the thousands still require you to buy the copy plus a subscription on top to even be able to play them at all. And backloading the price barrier, or the paywall, was very important in terms of attracting a larger market. And why we saw so many non-gamers enter the industry or enter the game side of things with the rise of mobile games such as Farmville, Clash of Clans, Candy Crush Saga, and you name it. Now, of course, this is probably one of the few on this list that's definitely more on the negative side of things, because we are seeing more discussions about banning loot boxes and really starting to crack down on these monetization elements. But again, the impact they've had on what it means to make video games these days cannot be undersold. Now, one of the more interesting aspects behind the last 2 points about mobile and handheld games was this greater approach to getting more people in the game industry. And with that point in mind, number 6 on my list is the Nintendo Wii. I still can't believe the Wii came out in 2011. When I looked it up, I thought it came out a little bit earlier than that. But, like I said, Nintendo has been one of those companies that when they do something, everybody else shuts up and listens. And for the longest time, again, the thousands was not kind to Nintendo. This was when they arguably fell into the basically into the bottom of the pack among the major manufacturers of consoles. And the problem, of course, was we began to see Nintendo embrace the strategy with the GameCube of trying to be different than everybody else. We'll talk more about that in our next listing here. But the GameCube arguably had a different control scheme compared to the PlayStation and Xbox line. And Nintendo was trying, again, to stand out in their own unique way. But the problem was they were losing it when it came to third-party games. Again, a Nintendo game is a Nintendo game. You know people are going to buy the next main entry in a Mario, Zelda, Metroid, whatever game pretty much day one. But then what do you do for the rest of the time that you're not playing those games? And Nintendo struggled with its third-party support. And the point again was, do I buy a Nintendo system and get a few good games and then get nothing else? Or do I buy an Xbox or a PlayStation and get just this huge supply of games? Again, the PlayStation 1 to PlayStation 2 line are considered to be, or that era is like one of the golden ages of the game industry, just in terms of the sheer quality of games on those consoles. But when Nintendo launched the Nintendo Wii, this was kind of both the culmination and the official change of Nintendo as a console manufacturer in terms of their strategy. The Wii stands alone at that time compared to anything else on the market. They decided to just completely buck UI conventions and control scheme standardization to do their own thing. And this gave them the ability to basically say, and this became their marketing strategy from there on out, the games that are available on our console, you will never be able to play them on another platform. Now, that rang true to some extent with the GameCube, as well as we could argue the N64 side of things. But that was considered more of a negative due to the lack of third-party games. Nintendo basically forced everybody to step up their game, no pun intended, with the Nintendo Wii. And not only that, but it also gave them a platform that they knew everybody would be talking about. And this was huge. And like I said, the last 2 points about mobile and handheld games, about offering more of a playable experience and getting people to play games anywhere else, the Wii became a major element for getting non-gamers in. You may, again, we can all laugh at motion and gesture-based controls, but this became a big deal in terms of being more open to non-gamers. And again, there have been plenty of jokes about watching grandparents use Wii bowling and things like that. But the Nintendo Wii really opened things up for a casual market. Now, we can argue that this was also kind of Nintendo backing away from its hardcore side of things, and that's a topic for another day. But the Wii became Nintendo's major signal that they were going to be doing something different, and obviously this kind of went forward with the Wii U, not so much in a good way, and then with the Switch. And I mean, the Switch itself, it's literally a portable console, and that's something nobody else has done. And even Sony and Microsoft tried to emulate the Wii when they did, I think it was the PlayStation Move and the Xbox Kinect. Now, of course, motion-based controls and that kind of gesture did go away, but we are seeing more in terms of the VR and AR space. And we can kind of trace this back to Nintendo Wii, and proving that Nintendo didn't run out of ideas. And most importantly, this would set things up for Nintendo's position in the console side of things to this day. That you're going to buy either a PlayStation or an Xbox because they are largely interchangeable outside of their first-party games. And again, I'm going to piss off the fanboys with that one. And then you're going to buy a Nintendo system because you know that you're not going to find anything else or anything else from Nintendo on another platform, even the PC. And we could even see this being translated to Nintendo Labo or Lado, whatever it was called, Lago, and of course the Amiibos. But with that said, we've been talking pretty straightly for a good amount of time, so I'm going to do my quick Patreon supporter and sponsor shout break now, and when we come back, I'm going to ramble on about points number 5 through 1. And now for a quick shout out to our current Game Wisdom supporters and sponsors. Going forward, all Patreon supporters will get early access to our videos. And if you'd like to continue this discussion on game design, be sure to check out our Discord channel, link down below. If you're looking for more wisdom about game design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books, 20 Essential Games to Study, aimed for first-time developers and students looking for some inspiration for their upcoming games, and Game Design Deep Dive Platformers if you're interested in anything regarding 2D and 3D platforming design. They're both available in print, digital, and wherever books are being sold. And we are back. So, we've covered some of the major console side of things in the last 5 points, but for the remaining half, we're going to get into some of the more, I think, both abstract and even more far-reaching elements. And we're starting with one that I've talked about many times over that does not get enough credit, I feel, among the game industry and people who cover games. And that is the rise or the standardization of UI and controller technology, or just control schemes in general. Now, this is one of those things that for modern fans of the game industry, like 10, 15 years at this point, you're not really thinking about this. But you need to remember that from the 80s into the early 2000s, everybody was trying to do their own thing in terms of what UI meant. Everybody wanted to become the standard so that they would basically be copied by everyone else. And this led to all manner of crazy game designs, UIs, and so on. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people call like the late 80s into the 90s one of the golden ages of PC gaming, because of the fact that this is when we saw some of the most experimental and just inspirational games being released, from XCOM, Star Control, and the golden age of the adventure game genre, and so on. But the problem was, this was a nightmare in terms of playability and accessibility. Everybody using a different control scheme means that it becomes very hard to figure out how to play a new game. And let's not even get into the discussion about how many console and PC games basically require you to read the manual, because there is no way you would learn how any of the things would work while playing the game. And our lovely keyboard and mouse, which I'm pointing to that you can't see right now, so many UIs that were just horrible for the PC side of things. And again, so people have made use of rose-tinted glasses to look back fondly on that, but no, it was pretty bad. And one of the major things that happened to the game industry, and that really changed a lot, was this acceptance of a standard for UI. And we could say that this began basically at the start of the thousands. around the PlayStation 3, Xbox One kind of era. Or not Xbox One, just Xbox. There's an Xbox One, there's an original Xbox. Again, the confusion of the Xbox line. But this is when gamepad technology and just the layouts became standardized. That we didn't need to worry from a development standpoint, oh, what if we release a game on this platform that has 4 buttons and this one has 6 or 2? And this was also one of the reasons why porting games from PC to console and vice versa was a major pain. Excuse me, if you ever want a nightmare, you can try to play the Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six that was ported to the Sega Dreamcast. And just the pain it was to control that. But as the game industry began to accept these standards of UI, this began this period of streamlining control schemes and beginning to adopt better practices for UI design. Context-sensitive commands instead of needing every command having its own individual button, making it easier or using affordances when it comes to the control schemes. Again, it doesn't sound simple, but being able to press the right trigger here and shoot a gun in a game, that was revolutionary for a time. And let's not forget having a right analog stick for camera controls. And some very famous quotes of people saying that this was a horrible idea and would never catch on. Don't worry, that phrase was going to come back in a few minutes. But UI standardization is a very big deal because it freed up developers to not care or not have to focus so much on being different in terms of the control scheme, but be different in terms of its gameplay and its game design loops. And this has opened up a lot of doors for being able to play these video games. And that takes me to number 4. The growth of cross-platform or cross-play development. For us older gamers, we remember a time that the game industry itself was just simply locked to its respective platform. You bought a Nintendo game, you will never play anything, or you will never interact with any other console or video gamer. PC was locked, and so on and so forth. But the rise of cross-platform support for games and being able to produce games on multiple platforms is a very big deal in terms of opening up the market, and is actually one of the big elements of the top 3 picks for this list. As we've seen over the last 20 years, with the rise of UI standardization also came the ability to know that I know that my game is going to function from a gameplay and a UI point of view on the PlayStation the same way it's going to be on an Xbox. And this meant that outside again of those first-party platform-locked titles, and we're even seeing that possibly being shaken up these days, I could buy a game and experience it regardless of my platform. And this led to a very wide range of third-party games and opening up the doors for giving them more of a market share. One of the biggest things was being able to port console to PC and vice versa, because again, the PC for the longest time was a locked platform. This led to that ever popular thing, the PC master race versus the console fanboys or things like that. But that stigma, at least I hope it has, been quieted down over the last 10 years. Now that PCs have gamepads we can hook up to them, and with more console games being brought over here, it is now possible to play a console game on a PC. And even vice versa, we have seen PC games brought to the consoles. And that was something that from the 80s into the early 2000s, we never saw that happen. And the proof positive that culminated with this has been Japanese games being brought to the PC. Japan, for the longest time, did not support the PC platform with its games. And I think there's more of a story there than we have the time to do in this video. But as of like the last 4 or 5 years, they have been more than welcoming to get their games over here. The fact that Yakuza, Dark Souls, and even some of the Dynasty Wars and Romance of the Three Kingdoms games have been ported to PC and now are available on Steam is just mind-boggling to me. And this kind of cross-platform play has been really big in giving smaller games more chances to succeed, because it has opened up the door for indie developers to bring their games over as well. There is, of course, the famous example that at one point, The Binding of Isaac was not allowed on Nintendo Wii because they didn't want a game so polarizing and controversial. Then we fast forward many years later, and of course Edmund McMillan's game is now front and center as the opening console launch on the Switch, which I'm sure he still is laughing to the bank about on that one. And this kind of cross-platform play allows not only more people to play these games, but again, it allows smaller games a chance to succeed. There are so many kind of AA games and smaller titles that were released over the last 20 years that could have been done so much better with a PC audience. And we're now starting to get that. And going forward, we may be seeing more of cross-platform play becoming front and center. Fortnite, strange as it may sound, was the game that really began to open up this door, that mobile gamers can play with PC gamers, who can play with Switch owners, and then they forced Sony to open things up as well. And again, this stuff may sound ordinary today, but tell this to an older gamer or someone from 20 to 25 years ago this was going to happen, and they wouldn't believe you. And speaking about something that I think most people would not believe, we got number 3, which you probably have figured out that it was going to be in the top 3 at some point. And that, my friends, is of course Steam. Or Steam/digital platforms. Steam, in of itself, completely changed everything. It has led to not only the rebirth of the PC market, but it has completely and radically changed what it means to own, buy, and develop games today. I still remember back in 2004 that with Half-Life 2, Valve wanted a way to secure the game, and not only that, but start to track analytics as to how many people play it, how many people got to this point, or beat this boss, or etc. So they came with this idea to attach their games to a third-party platform that people have to sign up, download the games from their internet, and play it like that. This just, horrible idea that, everybody thought this was going to fail. And it did not. The growth of the digital platform of the game industry, again, for the younger people watching this right now who are playing games on their smartphones, have Steam accounts, have itch.io accounts, and so on, it sounds, ordinary these days. But this was a turning point for the game industry. It was also a major element about the idea of ownership. Previously, the protection of a game was tied to the storage medium it was on. If I wanted to play a Super Nintendo game, I needed that game and I needed the Super Nintendo cartridge of it. With the digital rights and the account focus, this changed. Now everything is tied to an account that can then be transferred to any computer or even any console if you decide to switch to a different console for your PSN account, XBLA, Switch, and so on. It changed how we own games. Instead of needing, shelves and shelves and shelves of games behind me, it is all stored on my Steam account or GOG and so on. And from the independent side of things, this blew open the door for self-publishing and being able to sell your game without needing a retail space. We could arguably say that Steam is one of the major nails in the coffin for Circuit City, for Blockbuster Video, and we could arguably say for GameStop possibly, if the news is any indication. But the fact that I can own my games and basically have them infinitely available as long as I have internet access was massive. One of the biggest things, and I always like this to use as an example, today I can buy a game that I want that's not out for 6 months, download the necessary files, and then minute one of that game being released, I can play it and never have to leave my home. I never have to stand in line or fight people at a shopping mall ever again. And again, I'm really dating myself with that one, I think. But Steam really became one of the major turning points of the game industry, and it's led to discussions about what does ownership mean, what does used games mean today. And again, this video is already getting long enough. This is why I can't do too many top 10 lists, because it's just going to be me ranting on endlessly on topics. But Steam itself paved the way for a lot of changes to this game industry, and especially our last 2 points. And for that, number 2 is one that I'm sure a few of you watching this are well aware of. The rise of the independent scene. The indie dev movement quietly went on as far back as the 90s, but it wasn't until the rise of Steam, and we could say maybe around 2008, 2010, thereabout, that the idea of being an independent developer started to be shown as viable. For the longest time, people looked at indie games as being shovelware, trash bin games, and the stuff that you buy for your for a grandchild when you're rushing to their birthday party and you forgot to get them a gift. But with games such as Cave Story, Fez, Braid, Super Meat Boy, developers and consumers alike began to take notice that you could make a legitimately amazing game, and you didn't need millions of dollars and dozens of people and worldwide studios to do it. As another big point, it also meant that you didn't need to worry about Walmart, Kmart, any kind of retail store in order to sell your game. And like I said, with Steam bringing this into the limelight, today you can spend $100 and get a Steam store page. You can be on itch.io. And so many developers have moved to the independent space and have done amazing work in it. And the last 10 years, the bar of quality from 2010 to 2019 was, you cannot track just how much things have grown. In the last 2 years, we've seen games such as Untitled Goose Game, Celeste, Disco Elysium, standing side by side to AAA games at award shows. That did not happen 10 to 15 years ago. This has also opened up the door for independent development. Again, there are people who are making games in the comfort of their own home with people that they have never met in person on continents that they may never visit in their entire lives, and they are able to work together to make original titles. And the originality of the independent space has been one of its just far-reaching impacts. We not only see, platformers, shooters, and some of the games we see in the AAA space, we have seen games that have talked about topics such as suicide, LGBT plus rights, even games that have looked at war and tragic events. And while there have certainly been a lot of duds and games that we can't mention here how mature and graphic they are, you cannot deny the sheer variety of games that have came from the independent space. And again, we have to thank the digital platform movement for that. And again, we could segue and talk about the indie apocalypse and how hard it is being a developer these days, but that's way too big for this already big video. But their impact on the game industry and what it means to make games, we are going to be feeling that for decades to come. And who knows, maybe that will become the new norm at some point. or it could even have become the new norm, as we have even seen the console manufacturers fully embrace the independent space. The fact that Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo want indies on their system, again, that didn't happen 10, 15 years ago. And it has become such a way of life for the game industry and for game development that, again, it's just completely far reaching. So, with that, what would be number one then? Number one is kind of an extension of the last few points, and about what it means to develop games. And that is the rise of live service slash early access design, or this idea of ongoing development. For the longest time, probably for almost 30, maybe 40 years of the game industry, games were considered one and done. I release the game, I move on to the next one. That last game is, locked in stone. It will never be changed. Even among PC developers, it was basically, we release the game, we'll release an expansion, maybe a patch to fix any outstanding bugs, it's gone, we move on to the next. And this was kind of the way of operating with the game industry. You never wanted to spend too much time on a game because there was only so much money you could get out of it. But as we saw, this became kind of the evolution of the MMO-based model. That if a game was really popular and people were going to keep playing it, why don't we keep developing for it and get more money out of it? And this really began to be seen with titles such as Team Fortress 2 and League of Legends. That you're going to buy a game, and guess what? You're going to keep getting content out of it. You're going to keep getting reasons to spend money on this game. And again, for the younger audience, or people who just got in the game industry in the last few years watching this, that's been the norm. But this changed a lot about game design. That you didn't have to approach games as once it's released, it is done. And some of the best games that have came out became basically, when it's released, we're going to keep making stuff for it and getting support for it. With the rise of monetization and microtransactions, this has again led to this idea of a live service game. That I can keep putting out content, keep getting paid, and I can keep making this game for as long as people are willing to play it. This has been a major point about the growth of esports. That a game is no longer released and done. It can be kept supported for as long as there is interest. This has been a major point about mitigating the risk. Why should I invest a lot of money into an IP that nobody's ever heard of, that hasn't been released yet, if I can guarantee sales and interest on a popular franchise? And not only that, but if it does well enough, we can support that with a sequel. And we have seen probably one of the most craziest development cycles with a lot of AAA games, where they'll release a game, they'll release DLC up until almost the release of the next game. People stop playing the first game, and then they're going to buy more DLC and start the same process again with the next one. This isn't having your cake and eating it too. This is like quadruple or 6 times doubling down, or however you want to describe it, in terms of having your cake and eating it too. And this has been extended into the idea of early access. That you don't have to show people your game at 1.0. You can release it technically early, get free feedback and playtesting hopefully, and develop your game while earning the money for development. Now, of course, this has again led to a lot of, unfortunately, stinkers and games that have not done so well. But it has also opened up the door for more experimental games and for titles to be refined far more than they would have otherwise. A few nights ago, I played the game Hinterland by Tilted Mill, and I swear to this day that if that game would have been released during this whole idea of early access, it would have done 1,000 times better. And I could imagine just how much more Left 4 Dead could have gone if it was just released maybe 3 years later, when more of games as a service and live service design was at the forefront. And like I said, today, it's considered strange for you to release a game and be done with it. That's the grand weirdness of this industry. In the old days, you release a game and then it's strange for you to keep working on it. Today, you release that game and people will hound you if you don't keep working on it. And there is so much more to this that I don't have the time to really get into. But that has been this top 10 list. Let me know what you think about it while my voice is completely dying on me. This is why, again, I don't like to do these top 10 lists so much, because it's just going to be me ranting for a very long time. But thank you for watching this video. If you have any suggestions for future topics, let me know in the comments below. Check out our Discord and Patreon link down below. And come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoy things, be sure to do all the liking and subscribing that the kids are doing these days. Check out our Discord channel link down below, where we hang out and chat game design, and come back later tonight for our regular streamings. But that's it, and tune in for more great content here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games.